Are there specific areas that you focus on where data becomes very important, like domestic violence, for instance?
In the domestic violence space, people are not as often ready to speak about what's happened to them because they're, they're stigmatized. There's a sense that there's a dirtiness about domestic violence that women don't want to talk about, that boys don't want to talk about. And so there's less data coming out of areas like domestic violence than there really needs to be in order to approach the problem more cohesively. But we look very closely at what other foundations are doing. We look at data from the government. We look at landscape data from, if we're working in health, from hospitals. We work with organizations that are mapping. We work with UEI, the Urban Education Institute, and the Crime Lab here in Chicago on where guns are coming from. So there are a number of organizations that are collecting data and who have found themselves kind of in front of the spotlight because there aren't a lot of groups that are talking about this data, and once you have it, you really need to be able to share it so that it's used across the board.
How do you handle contingencies and ambiguities as an ethical leader? By that I mean sometimes the rules are not as clear as they ought to be. Sometimes there's inadequate data, and there are places where you're not quite certain what the real situation is.
Well, I think you rely on testimonies from people, but not just from individuals, from communities. You talk about successes and you rely on experience. People who go out, and you were talking earlier about your experience at this orphanage and how meaningful that firsthand experience was. Unless you were actually there, it's very hard to get the sense. If the woman who ran that organization, and I had quite a few experiences with her, if she came and sat in this room with us, you would hear her narrative, but you wouldn't have experienced it yourself. And I think going on a site visit and engaging very, very humanly and very authentically with the people who are exposed to the kinds of trauma that they are exposed to, and often overcoming it with an incredible resilience changes the way you think about a process and a project.
I'd like to hear you talk a little more. We call that the retooler way of doing ethics. I'd like to hear more about that.
Nelson Mandela said the glory of life is not in how many times you fall down, but in being able to rise up.
Wow.
And what really strikes me about that quote is it's not about power or leadership. It's all encompassed in this concept of this is the glory of living. And so I think that we make mistakes. We have data, we hear testimonies, we invest as carefully as we possibly can. We look to make sure that we don't, that we don't trip up and do any damage, but it happens. And once we do that, we've got to regroup, take a step back and say either how do we fix this or how do we do it better next time.